Economic growth has become the central mantra or mission of this government. And they're not alone in that. Most governments want to pursue economic growth. Who's going to be against it? Who's against having higher standard of living, more tax revenue to spend on public expenditure, and lots of subsidies to dole out? But before we get completely carried away with the latest of the government's obsessions, let's just stand back for a moment and ask ourselves, what is the growth that the government wishes to pursue? It's a good idea to know what it is that you're trying to achieve before you set about trying, indeed, to achieve it. What causes growth? And what about all those painful trade-offs that are already becoming apparent? Who's going to pay for it? And how is it going to be delivered? Well, these are all good questions. And the remarkable thing is that it seems the government's got no answers to any of those questions which are credible and likely to produce sustainable economic growth. And, they're not alone. Last government suffered from very similar confusions and an inability to define precisely what the policies that they were trying to advance meant. So let's start with what it is. Is it GDP or is it GDP per head? You can get economic growth in the terms the government might like it, GDP. You might even be the highest amongst the G7 for economic growth, which, if you recall, was the government's objective. But you could do it by just simply adding more people. How about 750,000 a year? Another 5 million by the beginning of the next decade. It's unlikely they're going to add nothing in terms of consumption. And since GDP is just consumption plus investment, and in Britain it's basically consumption, because although we do some savings, that isn't enough to compensate for even the capital depreciation. So GDP per se isn't a pretty good measure. GDP per head gets a bit closer, but you still have to go to that GDP bit. And if you ask a more practical question, like looking at the British economy and saying, what would it look like if it was in better shape in 5 or 10 years' time? You might have a look at the states of the infrastructures, the states of the assets. You might have a look at the balance between consumption and investment. You might look about whether things are being maintained properly, and so on and so forth. And proper national income accounts would display how little actual capital maintenance we're doing, fixing the tiles on the roof, while pretending we're going to do a hell of a lot of investment, and sometime in the future rather than now. And that brings us to fundamental questions about what actually causes economic growth. The government would have us believe that the next bout of growth is going to be achieved by making lots of announcements. And indeed, the growth in announcements is quite noticeable. These are announcements of big projects to show the government is serious about economic growth. No small sort of necessary bits of investment here and there, no fixing the potholes, etc., as the headlines. No. It's got to be runways at airports, and what's more, at least 3 of them. It's got to be 7 or 8 or 9 reservoirs, not some improvements in the water networks. It's got to be the largest theme park in Europe. These are the sorts of things government likes to announce because it looks big, it hits the headlines. And the government wants to approve 150 projects by the end of the Parliament. Well, George Osborne was on the same piece of paper in 2010, 2011, when he wanted to approve 500 projects in the National Infrastructure Plan. Nothing new about this, but announcements don't make growth, and announcements of big projects probably don't get to the core of the difficulties our economy faces. And that really brings us to the next bite of the growth cherry. So Politics, as Tony Blair once explained to me years and years ago, is about using the word and whenever someone proposes the word or. So, we can't have net zero priorities and higher energy bills or economic growth. It's got to be and net zero and growth. We can't have environmental improvements or building lots of houses on the green belt, etc. It's got to be and. And we can't have changing the costs to employers by, let's say, reducing the cost of labour and have more workers' rights, pay the as-left tax, as you might regard it, and increase the taxes on business for employing people in national insurance. The sad fact is, and it's one of the reasons why the repeated attempts by governments to get more growth have typically failed, is that there are trade-offs. It is either or. It isn't always and. And the either or comes very harshly to this government. So if you want growth as your number one mission and net zero and other things are second, well, you better make it so. You can't go around increasing taxes on businesses for employing people, national insurance. You can't go around increasing workers' rights, which is an extra cost to business. You can't go on raising the national minimum wage, and you can't go on paying public sector workers in railways or in the NHS lots of money without reform. Those things which are nice to have and, of course, politically incredibly desirable are also working in the opposite direction to economic growth. And the government will have to discover, painfully probably, that if you add to that unfunded public expenditure and drive up the cost of capital as a result as well, it's even less likely you're going to achieve the growth you want. So yes, you could make growth the number one mission. You could actually make some difference to economic growth. But you'd have to make some hard choices. And this government, like most governments, is about avoiding hard choices. It's about the and, not the or. And as the UK advances to a tax burden that's about as far as you can take it, and as the public sector's productivity declines, we have reached that crucial point. And for this government, they either have to cross the Rubicon and confront the public sector, confront the costs of labour, and seriously get in the business of having budgets which don't drive up the cost of capital, or they'll have to carry on living roughly where we are, which is that GDP nudges up a bit. Pretty hard not to nudge up a bit, but GDP per head tells you another story. Now, next question is, so you want economic growth and you are, let's just say for a moment, let's be charitable, willing to make hard choices, the ors rather than the ands, or at least some of them. So who's going to pay for it? Where's the money coming from? Oh, well, that's all right. We're all just going to borrow it. All these foreigners are going to lend us money because we don't save very much here, net of capital depreciation. So let's go round and visit the autocrats, and it's mainly the autocrats around the world, the Chinese, the Saudis and so on, and say, look, you've got bags of money. Why don't you just lend it to us? And then you can present it to the public saying, well, this isn't increasing our budget deficits. It isn't going to cost you anything because this is all going to be self-financing. It's all going to be happy-clappy. We get the money. They all give the money to us and we invest it. Actually, most of it's capital maintenance. And then you know what outcome of it? Well, you won't have higher bills. Utter rubbish. The truth is that if you want to invest, if you seriously want to promote economic growth, it's going to cost. And that's true of net zero, despite the Secretary of State belief that it's a win-win, that it's cheaper energy and it's economic growth and it's carbon reducing and so on. It's going to cost. And you know who's going to pay? Well, You don't want to make it too explicit for political reasons. No government wants to do that. So let's put it below the radar. You're going to pay it in your electricity bill. You're going to pay it in your water bill. You're going to pay it in your rail costs. You're going to pay it in your communications costs. And you're going to pay in a council tax and so on and so forth. How's that? Well, just have a look at the energy taxes we're paying. Where do you think all the money comes from to pay for all those CFDs, the contracts for all that wind and solar? Where do you think all the money comes for the great, in inverted commas, investments in the electricity networks? Well, it comes from your electricity bill. You've got to pay the interest and you've got to pay the capital back and you've got to pay the dividends. And it turns out that 25%, a quarter of all your electricity bills, is basically levies and subsidies. It's a tax. You pay electricity costs plus the electricity tax. Let's turn to water. There are a whole lot of things that water companies do for us. Clean up our mess that we put down the toilets and the drains, clean up the consequences of the storm overflows, etc. All the things that, in most European countries, and used to be here in the UK, local government does. Just like they provide police and they provide all sorts of local services, which you pay for in your council tax. Well, some of your bills to the utilities, which used to be municipal taxes, used to be listed out a long time ago on your effectively council tax bill, they're all now being paid as water customers or electricity customers or whatever the utility is. Nothing wrong with that, but let's be honest about it. So if we want a new runway at Heathrow in 2040 or whenever, we're going to trample on the net zero, whatever the government says. Okay, well, growth first before net zero. But how are we going to pay for it? Well, you're going to pay a levy now or pretty soon on every flight you have to provide the money to build that asset. That's not free. That's a cost. It may be a perfectly legitimate cost, but what you're witnessing across the piece is that all the utility bills are being increased pretty systematically to raise money to pay for all this, what I think is capital maintenance, but the government call investment, to pay for the growth. Good bargain? Quite possibly so. But do bear in mind before you get too carried away about the charging of all this stuff as what I would call hypothecated taxes to the utilities. Do mind as to whether you think that the customers are A, going to be able to pay, and B, whether they're going to be willing to vote for politicians who are going to force them to pay. This reality dawns on every local government, rightly so, when it thinks about how it's going to pay for enhanced services in its local communities. It has to work out, can I persuade the local electors to vote for me if I say I'm going to put those charges up? And be clear, UK has the highest industrial energy prices or electricity prices in the developed world and the fifth highest consumer bills. It has very high water bills already relative to what happens in other countries. It has some of the most expensive railway lines in the developed world, and so on. We don't start at the bottom of the pile with lots of scope to take money out of people's pockets to pay for all this stuff. No, we start at the top of the pile, and that's a result of what we've done in privatisation to try to reduce the public input to this and to pay the sorts of returns that private companies need as opposed to state-owned ones. Nothing against this, and nothing to say that we shouldn't be putting up water bills. But we have to be clear how this is being paid for. Not as some, happy clappy, it's all going to be fine, win-win stuff. You're going to pay for the investments and the capital maintenance for net zero. You're going to pay for the reservoirs and the water going forward. You're going to pay even to keep our railway system on track. And all of that needs to be thought through before we get to the hard question of how is this stuff going to be delivered? Now, that'll be the subject of subsequent podcasts, but Let me just make an observation. When people get terribly carried away that they're going to do net zero electricity within 60 months, that's what the government says it's going to do. Here in Oxford, we're on for 3.5 years to put a new bridge over the Botley Road for the train station. Just think about that. The reality, what actually happens, and the wonderful world of government and officials imagining what it's going to be like. We're going to pay for that reality. Someone has to absorb the costs, and that's us. And politicians who want to promote economic growth, perfectly understandably, should tell us the truth. It's lots of ors, not just and. And that's the political problem, because, as Tony Blair said to me years ago, the political art is using the word and, not or. The economic art, the growth art, the reality is or is the most obvious and most common word that politicians should be using right now. Thank you.